Some people spend their whole lives serving others, only to be forgotten when it matters most. Today's story follows a quiet veteran who returned after years away, carrying letters that made an entire town stop and listen. If you've ever known someone whose silence said more than words, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard. It started on a Monday, early morning, before the sun had warmed the sidewalk, before most windows lit up with kitchen lights or coffee pots started perking. The town still slept, except for the boy with the newspaper bag slung over his shoulder and the man sitting quietly on the bench outside the old post office. The boy, whose name was Elijah, had walked this same route since school let out for the summer. Same corner, same porches, same sleepy dogs and front doors that never locked. But today, something felt different. Someone was there who hadn't been there before. The man didn't move when Elijah passed, didn't speak, didn't even look up, just sat there with his hands resting on a wooden cane, a dark green coat folded neatly across his lap. He wore old boots, polished but worn, and a hat that looked like it belonged to another decade. Elijah slowed, glanced once, then kept walking. He didn't think much of it until the next day, when the man was there again, same bench, same stillness. Only this time, the man had a letter in his hand. He stood, slow but steady, walked to the blue mailbox near the curb, and slid the letter in with both hands, like it mattered more than a regular envelope should. Then he sat back down and waited. For what, Elijah didn't know. By Wednesday, word had started to drift across back fences and corner stores. That bench hadn't seen anyone sit there in years, not since the post office was closed down and turned into storage for city records. But now, every morning, the man appeared, always just before sunrise, always gone before noon. Some folks thought he might be homeless. Others figured he was waiting for someone, maybe a bus that didn't run anymore, maybe a memory. Elijah wasn't sure why he kept noticing the man, only that something about him felt permanent, like a statue, except for one that blinked, breathed, and mailed letters to nobody. On Thursday, Elijah paused long enough to see the man look up. Just once. Their eyes met. The man's were pale grey, almost cloudy, but not empty. There was something behind them, a weight, like he'd seen things and carried them for too long. He raised 2 fingers in a slow, gentle salute, then dropped them to the top of his cane and said nothing. Elijah didn't salute back. He just nodded, and for some reason, it felt like the right thing to do. By Friday, the routine had settled into something the neighborhood began to expect. A man on a bench, a letter in the box, silence, nothing else. People started walking their dogs a little closer to the curb, slowing just enough to see if he'd move, if he'd speak. He never did. A woman from down the street, Linda Bramble, finally decided to approach him. She wasn't shy, had lived in town for 40 years and buried a husband who served in Korea. She knew the look of someone who carried more than groceries. She brought him a cup of coffee, told him it was hot, and asked if he wanted cream. He nodded once. Just once. Then I took the cup with both hands and held it, without drinking. Linda sat beside him without asking. For a few minutes they watched the sun hit the flagpole in front of the courthouse across the street. When she asked his name, he didn't answer. But he did smile, barely. Not polite, but real, a little crooked, a little sad. Then she saw his boots, and she froze. She'd seen boots like that before. Same cut, same laces, same polished pattern. Military issue, vintage, preserved. The kind her husband used to shine on Sundays, even after he stopped walking in them. She looked closer and noticed the jacket on his lap wasn't just any coat. It was Air Force green. The old patch on the sleeve was too faded to read, but it was still stitched with care. Her breath caught. She looked at his face again, and something shifted. The cheekbones, the line of his jaw. She'd seen this man before. Not here, not recently, but years ago, in a photo frame that used to sit on her neighbor's mantel before it got packed away. She asked if he was who she thought he was. He didn't reply, but he didn't deny it either. Saturday morning, Elijah brought his camera. Not a phone camera, a real one, the kind his granddad had passed down. He kept it in a canvas bag with extra film rolls and notes in the margin. He didn't plan to take pictures, not at first. He just wanted to see if the man would be there again. He was. Same spot, same coat, same silence. But this time Elijah noticed something different. The man had a photo in his lap. An old one, black and white, edges curled like it had been held too many times. It showed two men in uniform, standing side by side, near what looked like a rescue chopper. One of them was clearly younger, broader, with the same pale grey eyes. Elijah didn't ask anything, but the man noticed him, held up the photo just enough so the boy could see it, then folded it carefully and tucked it back into the inside pocket of his coat. Elijah walked away, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, he asked his grandmother if she remembered a man named Chuck Norris. Not the actor, the other one, the one who used to live on Sandridge Road before the fire. Her face changed like someone lit a match under old memories. She remembered. Everyone had once. He was a veteran, a rescuer, the one they said saved 4 people from a landslide near Cascade Bluff. He used to be everywhere, at parades, at city hall meetings. He fixed fences without asking and shoveled snow for widows. Then one day he disappeared. No warning, no. Some said he moved away. Some whispered darker things. No one ever found out for sure. But now, here he was, or someone who looked just like him, sitting on a bench and mailing letters to nobody. By Sunday, people started showing up on purpose, not to bother him, just to be near him. They brought thermoses and sat on the grass. Kids rode bikes around the parking lot. A few old veterans came by and stood quietly for a minute, then left without speaking. Linda came back with an old album in her hands. She opened it slowly and pointed to a photo from a town parade 15 years earlier. There he was, Chuck Norris, standing in uniform next to the mayor, holding a folded flag. He hadn't just been part of the town. He'd been one of its pillars. Now he sat quietly, sending letters one by one every morning. Same handwriting, same return address left blank. The letters were never picked up. No one knew where they went. But people started noticing what they were labeled. Each had a name, not a person, a concept. To the one who forgot honor, to the quiet lie, to the man in the mirror, to the ones who hid the truth, to the boy who believed. 7 letters, 7 mornings, 7 shadows from the past. No one said what they thought it meant, but they felt it. And then, on the 7th day, Elijah arrived just before sunrise. The man wasn't on the bench yet. The mailbox was still empty, but there was a small shape tucked beside it. A package, wrapped in waxed brown paper, tied with twine. Inside it was a book, dog-eared, annotated, pages marked with dates and locations, and a name is written inside the front cover in careful script. Captain Charles Norris. There was also a note, not addressed to anyone, just 5 words. I didn't forget. Did you? Elijah looked up. The bench was still empty, but he knew something had changed. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was waiting for something. And he had a feeling the story was only just beginning. The package sat on the post office steps until well after sunrise, Elijah had left it untouched, in the same way he found it, not even daring to open it fully. He didn't know if he was supposed to. It didn't have his name on it, but it felt like it had been meant for someone who might not be around anymore. Mrs. Bramble showed up just after 7. She didn't say anything when Elijah pointed at the package. She just stared at it like she was remembering something hard. Then she asked if he had seen Chuck that morning. Elijah shook his head. That was the first morning he hadn't. People noticed quickly. By mid-morning, 2 older men from the VFW stopped by the bench. One of them had a cane, the other wore a windbreaker covered in faded patches. They stood near the bench for a while, said nothing, then quietly placed a folded flag on the seat and walked away. By the time noon came, the post office looked like a quiet vigil. 3 neighbors had brought folding chairs. A woman from the diner dropped off a small tray of muffins. Nobody knew what they were waiting for, but no one wanted to be the first to leave. Elijah finally brought the package home and showed it to his grandmother. He expected her to scold him for snooping, but she didn't. She just took one look at the cover of the book inside and sat down hard at the kitchen table. She opened the front page slowly. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the name, Captain Charles Norris. Inside were notes written in the margins, some dated all the way back to 1983. Reports, coordinates, names. None of it made much sense to Elijah, but his grandmother just kept reading. Then she pulled out one letter from the package that was folded separately from the rest. This one had no name, just a single sentence on the outside, to the one who forgot what silence can cost. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the past week in his head. The man on the bench, the letters, the names, the silence. He wondered why nobody had asked the obvious question out loud. Why did Chuck come back now? He got up early the next morning and rode his bike across town to the library. The local archive room had a binder full of old clippings, the kind no one touched unless they were writing a school report or trying to settle a bar bet about who ran the first hardware store. He searched for the name Charles Norris. The first mention was from 1979, a young Air Force captain assigned to the Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue Division. Then more from the 80s and 90s, flood rescue, avalanche recovery, missing hikers. His name kept showing up in places where people almost didn't survive. There was one photo from 1994. A boy, about 6 years old, was pulled from a ravine after a bus crash, wrapped in a blanket. Beside him, in uniform, was Chuck Norris. His face in the photo looked younger, but the eyes were exactly the same. Grey, clear, watching something no one else could see. The last article was dated 2011. The title was short, Local Hero Vanishes. The story said he had resigned from his position unexpectedly. He said that he had been under investigation for leaking classified information. But no charges were filed, no trial, just gone. Elijah printed the article and folded it into his pocket. He didn't know why, but he felt like something had been buried. Not just in the news, in the town, in the people who once knew this man and now didn't speak his name. The following day, Chuck returned. Same bench, same coat, same cane. Elijah saw him first and didn't know whether to run over or give space. He stayed across the street for a while until Chuck raised one hand, slow, palm out. Elijah walked over and stood beside the bench without sitting. He didn't ask where Chuck had been. He didn't ask what the letters meant. He just said he saw the article, the one from 2011. Chuck didn't answer right away, but he nodded once, then looked down at the ground like it weighed more than usual. He said, "People don't vanish without a reason. Sometimes they're pushed. Sometimes they leave before someone else makes them disappear." Elijah didn't understand it all, but he listened. Chuck told him a story, not with details, but with tone, about how silence can feel like safety and how keeping quiet can be mistaken for weakness. He said he'd written letters before, back when it might have mattered, but they weren't mailed. They were buried, not in the dirt, in filing cabinets, locked drawers, places people forget to check. Then he stopped talking and went quiet again. The next morning, one of the letters Chuck had mailed earlier in the week came back, returned to sender. The address had been real, once, an office for a defense contractor 3 towns over, but the building had been torn down years ago. In its place now sat a chain pharmacy. Elijah brought the envelope to Mrs. Bramble. She looked at the address and closed her eyes. Then she walked over to a drawer in her dining room and pulled out a photo. It showed 4 men in uniform, lined up in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. She pointed to the second man from the right. "That's Gregory Banks," she said. "He used to be Chuck's commanding officer." And the last person seen speaking to him before he disappeared. Nobody had heard from Gregory in years. Last anyone knew, he had joined a private firm doing international contracts. Some said it was logistics. Others whispered it was something else. Nobody ever knew for sure. But now it looked like Chuck had something he wanted Gregory to see. That week 2 more letters were returned, one postmarked to a judge, another to a former senator. All of them were sealed in thick paper, heavy with whatever lay inside. All of them were marked undeliverable. Moved, no forwarding. Chuck didn't seem surprised. He kept mailing them anyway, every morning, without fail, without explanation. Soon people started asking questions in whispers. What was in the letters? Why now? Was Chuck trying to expose something? Or was this just an old man chasing ghosts? Then came the morning when a different car parked across from the post office. It wasn't from town. It had government plates, dark windows. A man stepped out wearing a suit too stiff for this place and sunglasses too dark for 7 a.m. He didn't approach Chuck, just stood near the corner, pretending to read a newspaper that never turned a page. Elijah saw it happen. So did Linda. And so did 3 other people who had stopped by just to wave or drop off fresh coffee. That afternoon, the post office was closed by city order. Maintenance work, the sign said. But the timing felt wrong. Felt like someone wanted the bench empty again. Chuck didn't sit on the bench the next morning. He sat on the steps instead. Same coat, same cane, same calm. He didn't need the bench to be noticed. And he didn't need a building to keep sending letters. By now the whole town was talking, some quietly, some louder. People started remembering things. Favor Chuck had done. Times he'd shown up when nobody else would. Floods, fires, missing kids. People whose names had faded from the papers, but not from their families. Someone put up a poster near the diner. It had a photo of Chuck from the 1994 rescue. The headline was simple: "He was there for us. Maybe it's time we show up for him." By Sunday, there were 20 people standing on the sidewalk when Chuck walked up. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded and made room. Elijah stood beside him and handed him another envelope. This one was blank. Chuck looked at it for a moment, then smiled. He said, it didn't matter where it was sent. Sometimes the act of sending was enough. Then he dropped it in the mailbox and turned toward the rising sun. The town stood with him, still and quiet. Not because they understood everything, but because silence, when shared, could finally start to make a sound. It was Monday again. 1 full week since the man first sat on the bench with nothing but his coat, his cane, and letters nobody could quite explain. But now things felt different. People still watched, still brought coffee, still stayed a little longer than they meant to. But there was something new underneath it all. A hum. Like the town had started to listen. Chuck didn't speak much that day. He nodded to Elijah, nodded to Mrs. Bramble, then sat on the courthouse steps instead of the bench. He kept a small notebook in his lap and flipped through it like he was checking a list only he could read. At around 10 a.m. he walked into the diner for the first time. People turned their heads, not in surprise, but in something closer to respect. The kind of silence that follows someone who doesn't speak unless it matters. He sat at the corner booth by the window, ordered black coffee and nothing else, didn't touch the menu. He looked out the window like he was waiting. Not impatient, just steady. Linda came in shortly after and sat across from him. She didn't ask for permission. She just slid into the seat and folded her hands on the table. She asked one question. "Why now?" Chuck looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sometimes time isn't what makes people ready. It's silence. When you sit in it long enough, you hear what you tried to forget." He told her the letters were real, every one of them. Not just memory, not just a warning, but facts, names, places, dates. All were written down and sent to the people who had once tried to bury them. He said, "Not all wars are fought with weapons. Some are fought with ledgers and ink, and the kind of signatures that erase people without firing a shot." Linda didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. Chuck pulled a page from his notebook and handed it to her. It said one thing. 3:17 p.m., Tuesday, post office steps. 1 car, 1 passenger. No words. Linda didn't ask what it meant. She just folded the note and tucked it into her purse. That night, the town felt uneasy. Not scared, just still. Elijah stayed up late, trying to find out more about Gregory Banks. The name kept leading to places that had been deleted. Company websites have broken links, articles with no author, a photo from a business magazine, cropped at the edges, showing Banks at a ribbon cutting beside a senator who later resigned for unknown reasons. The more Elijah searched, the less he found if someone had gone out of their way to clean up. But they hadn't cleaned everything. An old blog post from 2009 described Banks as a rising executive in logistics contracting. It mentioned a pending investigation that never made it to trial. Sources claimed a whistleblower inside the Air Force had reported misuse of emergency funds during a series of flood rescues, but the charges were dropped. The whistleblower's name was redacted. Elijah didn't need the name. He already knew. Tuesday came fast. At exactly 3:11 p.m., Chuck walked to the steps of the old post office and sat down. No crowd, no fanfare, just a few quiet faces watching from the sidewalk. Linda stood near the alley, arms crossed. Elijah waited at the newspaper box across the street. Then, at 3:17, a black sedan rolled in from the east. It was clean, quiet, and unfamiliar. The engine cut off and a man stepped out. Broad shoulders, crisp shirt, gold cufflinks. He walked like someone who hadn't been told no in a long time. Chuck didn't stand up. The man didn't offer a handshake. He sat on the bench beside him like it had already been agreed. Nobody could hear what they said. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't argue. But Linda, from where she stood, noticed the shift in posture. The way the man kept glancing around. The way Chuck never looked away. After 6 minutes, the man stood and adjusted his sleeves. He said something final, sharp, and left. Chuck remained seated. Elijah crossed the street slowly. When he got close, he asked if everything was all right. Chuck smiled. He said, "The past has a way of showing up on time. All you have to do is leave the door open." That night, the lights in the courthouse stayed on late. Someone filed a FOA request. Someone else started calling old numbers. A copy of the original 2011 investigation began to circulate in the background. People didn't say much, but they noticed how certain folks around town suddenly stopped smiling. The next day, Chuck left another envelope in the mailbox. This one is thicker, sealed in wax. He didn't sit on the bench. He walked to the edge of the city park and stood near the war memorial. Elijah found him there, hands in his pockets, coat collar turned up against the wind. Chuck asked if he knew the difference between silence and peace. Elijah shook his head. Chuck said, "Peace is what happens when silence is no longer needed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo. It was the same one Elijah had seen before. The rescue chopper, the boy, the uniform. But this time, on the back, there was writing. 3 names. 2 of them crossed out. 1 circled. Banks. Chuck folded the photo and handed it over. He said it wasn't revenge he wanted, just a correction. Elijah nodded, not because he understood everything, but because some truths don't need full translation. They just need to be seen. Later that week, a package arrived at City Hall. No return address. Inside was a duplicate key. A small map. A location. City records showed it was a storage locker on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, leased in 2012. Inside they found boxes. Military documents, contracts, personal letters, tapes, some dated, some labeled, some not. A storm was coming. But this time the town wasn't going to pretend it didn't hear the thunder. They knew whose voice had brought it, and they were listening. The locker was colder than expected. Even in summer heat it held that dry metallic chill that comes with things shut away too long, the kind of stillness you feel in old hospital basements or war museums with flickering lights. When the city clerk opened it, the door creaked like it hadn't moved in years. No one from the press came, no one had to. The people who needed to be there already were. Sheriff Dalton, who'd served with the reserves back in '91, stood just inside the threshold. He looked around like he was stepping into a confession booth. Beside him stood Linda, arms crossed tight over her chest, jaw set. Elijah was there too, holding the folded map Chuck had given him, now smoothed out and pinned beneath his fingers like scripture. The first thing they saw was a green tin box sitting on a low shelf in the corner. It wasn't locked, just latched, like whoever placed it there didn't want it sealed, only protected. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, each tied with faded blue ribbon. Beside them, a thick manila folder marked simply, Directive 6A. Dalton opened it slowly. His hands were steady, but his breath wasn't. The folder held copies of procurement orders, emergency fund disbursements, signatures that matched real names. The kind people were still seen in newspapers. One of them was Gregory Banks. There were handwritten memos too, pages from a spiral-bound pad. Not official, not polished, but real. Chuck's handwriting from years ago, notes about supply shortages, missing equipment, and medevac delays. He documented everything. Not because someone asked him to, because he knew that someday someone might finally be ready to see. At the bottom of the box was a cassette tape, labeled only with the date, December 2010. They didn't play it right away. Nobody said it, but they all felt the same hesitation, like breaking the seal would change something, and maybe it would. The sheriff finally picked up the tape and turned to Elijah. "Can you find a player for this?" Elijah nodded. His granddad still had one in the garage, buried somewhere between a bucket of fishing lures and an old radio that only played gospel stations. They listened to the tape in Linda's living room that afternoon. It began with background noise, paper shuffling, then a voice, calm, precise, familiar. Gregory Banks. He was speaking plainly, like it was a debriefing, but the content didn't match the tone. He spoke about diverted funds, inflated invoices. Contracts were pushed through without oversight. Then came the part no one expected. He spoke about removing an obstacle, his exact words. He said Captain Charles Norris had been documenting too much, asking too many questions, drawing attention to things that needed to stay buried. He said it was better to cut the wire before the charge lights up. The tape ended with silence. Then Chuck's voice. Just a single sentence. This tape is not for revenge. It's for the day someone decides silence has gone on long enough. No one spoke for a while. Even Linda, who always had something to say, stayed quiet. Then Elijah reached down and picked up the photo from the tin box, the one Chuck had folded so carefully. On the back, next to the 3 names, someone had added a 4th. Ours. That night, word spread through the town. Not through headlines or broadcasts, through porches and diners, through cups of coffee poured slower than usual and hands that lingered on doorknobs. People started remembering what had been there all along. Chuck Norris hadn't just disappeared, he'd been removed. Quietly, efficiently, like a file deleted from a system most folks didn't even know existed. But he hadn't gone away. He'd been writing. And now, the pages were finally being read. The following day, Sheriff Dalton met Chuck near the edge of the bluff just outside town. No words at first, just wind and the sound of boots on dry grass. Dalton held out the tin box. "We heard it," he said. Chuck looked down at the box, then back at the horizon. "I didn't keep it to hurt anyone," he said. "I just didn't want to be the only one who knew." Dalton nodded. "We can't unhear it now." Chuck didn't smile, but there was a peace in the way his shoulders eased. He turned to go, but paused. He asked the sheriff one thing. "If you were me, would you have stayed silent?" Dalton took a long breath. "I think silence is a kind of wound," he said. "The longer it's there, the deeper it gets." Chuck nodded. That was enough. By Friday, the town council had called an emergency session. Closed doors, no press. But folks already knew what was coming. They knew because something in the town had shifted. Not in anger, not even in outrage, but in something deeper, a need to make space for what had been ignored. The post office reopened, no sign, no ribbon. But the bench had been replaced. New wood, same style. A plaque had been screwed into the side. It didn't name anyone, just 6 words. Some things don't fit in files. Elijah came by after school with a backpack full of notebooks. He asked Chuck if he could help write it all down. Chuck looked at him, amused. "You're already doing it," he said. Elijah grinned and sat beside him. He didn't ask what came next, because maybe that's what the story had always been about. Not what came next, but who stayed long enough to listen. Saturday came with grey skies and wind. Not the kind of wind that knocks things down, the kind that nudges memory loose. Soft, steady, like a hand brushing dust off old shelves. Chuck sat on the new bench outside the reopened post office. He didn't speak, he just watched. The sidewalk was wet from morning drizzle, the kind that soaked in slowly, without rushing. People came by, some stopped, most didn't, but almost every one of them looked at him a little longer than they would have a week ago. A nod, a lifted hand, some left things behind, a folded letter, a single flower. One man left his army cap on the armrest, then walked away without looking back. No one took photos. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. That afternoon, a handwritten notice appeared on the church bulletin board. White paper, black ink, taped with care. No name at the bottom, just a line that said, "Community Cleanup, Lakeview Property, Sunday 9 a.m. Come if you remember." The Lakeview property hadn't been mentioned in years. It had once been Chuck's home, before the fire, before the letters, before everything got quiet. The place still stood, barely. The porch sagged. The windows were clouded with age. The front gate leaned inward like it had given up. But the mailbox was still there, bent, rusted, but standing. Chuck hadn't been back in a decade. Not since it was sold out from under him, under papers he never signed. But Sunday morning, when he walked up the gravel road, he stopped short. The driveway was full. Trucks, minivans, a few rusted sedans, parked tight like people didn't want to leave space between them. At least 20 people stood on the lawn with work gloves and paint cans. A teenager held a rake taller than he was. An older woman passed out coffee in paper cups from a red thermos that had probably seen every church potluck since 1980. Linda stood on the porch in her Sunday shoes, sleeves rolled up, smiling like someone who had waited too long for this moment. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't have to. They got to work. No one took charge. No one asked for directions. They scraped paint, cleared weeds, hauled out broken chairs and a sagging mattress that smelled like mold and memory. 2 kids patched the picket fence with scrap wood from the hardware store. A man from the plumbing company offered to fix the water line for free, said it was the least he could do. Around noon, Elijah arrived carrying a grocery bag full of envelopes. He'd found them in the attic of his grandmother's house. Old mail addressed to Chuck that had never been forwarded, stacked and bundled unopened. He handed them over quietly. Chuck took them like they were heavier than they looked. Then he sat on the porch steps and started reading. One by one. Birthday cards from old friends. Letters from veterans who'd moved away. A card from a boy in Idaho thanking Captain Chuck for saving his sister in a flood. He read until his hands shook. Then he stopped. Linda sat beside him and placed her hand over his. "You were never forgotten," she said. "Just misplaced." Chuck nodded, eyes glassy. He folded one letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket. The cleanup lasted most of the day. By sunset, the yard was clear, the porch was painted, and someone had even hung wind chimes from the old cedar tree. They didn't have a ceremony, but they lit a few lanterns and left them glowing along the walkway. Chuck stood alone for a while near the edge of the driveway where the gravel met the main road. Elijah joined him. He asked Chuck if he was going to move back in. Chuck said he wasn't sure yet. Then he added that sometimes returning doesn't mean moving in. It means being willing to stand still long enough to be seen again. That evening, Elijah posted one sentence to the town's community board online. "He's not just back, he never left." Within an hour, 50 people had liked the post. Some added comments. Others just tagged names that hadn't been heard in years. That night, Lyndon made a pot of soup and brought it over in a mason jar wrapped with a towel. She didn't stay, just left it on the porch with a note. "Same recipe your wife used. I found it in the church cookbook on the 3rd page from the back." Chuck ate quietly, watching the lights flicker from across the hills. He hadn't turned on the porch light in 10 years, but that night he flipped the switch. Not because he needed to see, but because he knew someone might be looking. The porch light stayed on through the night, not out of fear, not because Chuck forgot to switch it off, but because some lights don't burn for safety reasons. They burn so others know someone is still home. Monday came with the sun through soft clouds, the kind of morning that feels like a pause between seasons, cool enough to need a jacket, warm enough not to mind forgetting it. Chuck walked into town a little after 9, same coat, same cane, same boots that still creaked on every 5th step. He moved slower now, but steadily, like someone who had walked a long road and knew it better. In silence than with noise. The bench outside the post office was empty when he arrived. But only for a moment. A man stepped forward from the sidewalk. He was younger than Chuck, maybe in his late 50s. He wore a denim jacket and a veteran's cap. No words passed between them, just a quiet handshake. Then another man came. And another. Soon the sidewalk filled, not crowded, just steady. No speeches, no press, just people who had read the letters, or lived the ones that had never been sent. Elijah stood nearby, notebook in hand. He had stopped writing, He said it felt wrong to take notes in a moment meant for memory. Across the street, the mayor stood beneath the courthouse flag. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't step forward, but she nodded, once, and that was enough. Sheriff Dalton appeared carrying a small wooden plaque, simple oak frame, no gloss, just a name and a sentence. Captain Charles Norris, for what you carried when no one else would. He handed it to Chuck, not with a flourish, just a firm grip and eyes that meant every word. Chuck took it with both hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Everyone there had already heard it in the way he stood just a little taller. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl, no more than 7, walked up holding a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, crayon on printer paper, a house with a porch, a man with grey hair, a bench and a mailbox, and above it, in careful handwriting, "Welcome home, Mr. Norris." She handed it to him without a word. Chuck looked at it for a long time. Then he knelt, slow, careful, and said one thing. "You drew the truth." The crowd didn't applaud. They just stood, still, together. That evening, a few people gathered at Lakeview for supper. Nothing formal, just soup, bread, and stories. These are the kinds of stories that don't need an audience. They only need witnesses. Chuck sat in the old rocking chair his wife once claimed as hers. It still leaned a little to the right. Ranger, the shepherd mix Elijah had rescued from the shelter last fall, lay curled at his feet, one eye always half open, like he was still on duty. Linda brought peach cobbler in a foil pan. Said it wouldn't win ribbons, but it'd do just fine for a night like this. They ate without a rush. Dishes clinked softly against spoons. No one filled the silence just to fill it. After dessert, the group sat on the porch, watching stars emerge. Chuck leaned back, hands folded across his chest, and listened. Someone was playing guitar down the road. Just a few soft chords. The same ones his wife used to hum when she made breakfast. He closed his eyes. He could hear the creak of the chair, the wind in the trees, the breath of the dog at his feet. He could feel the town breathing with him. That was the first night he slept through until morning. And when he woke, he didn't reach for the past. He stepped into the day like it belonged to him again. A week later, a new bench appeared on the hill just outside town. No plaque, no name, just a small metal box beneath the seat. Inside were blank postcards and pens. Anyone could sit and write. To someone they missed. To someone they forgave. To someone they couldn't reach in life, but could still talk to in memory. They called it the listening bench. Elijah left the first card. He didn't sign it. He just wrote, "I heard you. Thank you for not giving up." The last letter Chuck ever mailed didn't have an address. He walked to the box, placed it gently inside, and said something no one caught. But everyone understood. Not every hero fights, not every truth shouts. Sometimes it just sits, and waits, and remembers, and finally gets seen.